Thank you very much. Is this coming through okay? All right. It's really a delight to be here. I am jet lagged and everything that comes along with that. If I begin to speak in tongues, just stop me. I apologize that this has to be in English, but I don't know Danish, unfortunately. Let's all hope that English is not forced on this or any other part of Denmark. So I am quite happy to revise as we go along, depending on where people might want to slow down or speed up. So we'll see how this goes over the next few days, but I'm very open to feedback. The first two lectures this morning are going to be laying out some foundational ideas. So I'll just go ahead and begin. And I want us to be thinking throughout the next few days about the question of whether or not the salvific work or atoning work, Versöhnung, is that the language? Is it the same as the German Versöhnung? Oder? Yeah, atonement, almost, okay. How we think about this in relation to the person of Jesus, not just the singular event of the crucifixion. This is one of the things that I want us to be thinking about together. Okay, so I've titled these lectures, Is It Finished? Reflecting on Jesus' Sacrifice and Ongoing Intercession. And I want to begin with a question. Is the cross the sum total of Jesus' sacrifice? I find this to be a fascinating image. I've seen images like this on, for example, Easter morning in various Easter Sunday sermons that I've been a part of. And it's obviously an image that expresses a lot. And I have no interest in directly taking down, as it were, the deep piety that is reflected in an image like this. I don't intend to make fun of this at all. And yet there's something that I think is worth reflecting on here. What actually is the object of worship? And frankly, where is Jesus? Now, I use this image because in some ways, I don't know the context here, but it reflects in many ways the kind of theological context that I grew up in, and ways in which I was taught to think about something like atonement and Jesus' sacrifice. And I want to raise some questions around these kinds of ideas. And I want to begin by asking the question, what is sacrifice? What is going on when, especially Levitical sacrifice? It's an important qualification. What is Levitical sacrifice? What happens when sacrifice occurs? What are its goals? We can't cover all of this, but we'll try to introduce a few points here. And I want to begin by thinking about some modern assumptions about sacrifice and then potentially challenge or question those assumptions. This is one of many famous paintings done by Francisco Zurbarán, and I think it's, again, like the other image, it reflects something that certainly in my own English-speaking context would be the way that most people would think about sacrifice, not least in relation to Jesus. This is, in other words, a Christian image. We can recognize, for example, that the slab on which this animal is lying is an altar. We know that because we have certain assumptions about sacrifice. But as we'll see, that already is a fundamental mistake. Now, there's a lot going on in this image, as there is with the other one. But I want to suggest that as self-evident as an image like this appears to us, what we're really dealing with are modern assumptions which make our understanding of sacrifice self-evident, such that when we read a text like Leviticus, we tend to read ideas like this into Leviticus. And yet, they're, in my humble opinion, and the opinion of others, simply not there. So what are some of these common modern ideas? Again, I don't want to assume that these reflect your context and background, but I will present them. I anticipate that they would reflect certain things that you might also have heard, if not already hold. They certainly reflect my own context. The first is that sacrifice for us is often thought to be centrally all about killing something and death. Even the picture of that tied up sheep, we know that what's about to happen next is that the animal will be slaughtered on the altar. Again, that's a fundamental mistake, but we'll get there. But that's what we tend to assume because we think sacrifice is all about death. We also tend to think of sacrifice as fundamentally about giving something up, especially about giving up life. So we can use the language of sacrifice, again, in my own context. The language of sacrifice often underwrites certain claims to nationalist and political authority. Someone is willing to give up their life for their country. This is sacrifice. They sacrifice their life for the country. We're going to challenge whether or not giving up, we're going to challenge this idea of giving up as fundamental to sacrifice. We also can tend to think about sacrifice as punishment. Especially from a certain kind of Christian context, we can view sacrifice as an animal that suffers or bears some kind of punishment in the place of the offerer. It's often thought that in the process of sacrifice, when we read Leviticus, there is a moment where the offerer lays a hand on the head of the animal. There's a common assumption here that when that occurs, sin is transferred, if not in reality, at least symbolically, from the offerer to the animal, such that the animal can then die in the place of the offerer, bearing the punishment that the sinner deserved. So the animal somehow takes the place of the offerer. There's also a tendency to think that sacrifice is all about dealing with sin. And yet, that's only one part of Levitical sacrifice. We also view altars as sacred and holy, not least because we assume that altars are the places where animals are killed, and thus where sins are forgiven. Think back to the Agnus Dei painting at a couple of slides ago. We tend to view altars as holy because that is the place where an animal is slaughtered, and that's where the punishment for sin occurs, and that's where forgiveness of sin can then occur as well. But I'm going to suggest in the next few minutes that these are modern misconceptions. That this is not what we see going on in Leviticus. Which then raises a question. This is by no means simply, okay, therefore we rethink Christian theology. That's not the argument. It's rather a way of raising questions. If Leviticus is saying something different, then what do we do with certain Christian theological views in the light of that? So, as we begin, I want to start with this claim. Sacrifice is not a single event. Sacrifice is not killing an animal. Sacrifice is rather a process that brings a gift into the presence of God. If that proves to be an accurate way of understanding what's going on in Leviticus, then a whole number of other things are open, at least, for us to rethink relative to what's going on with sacrifice. Now, here's a lot of text, okay? I don't expect you to read this all, but I thought it'd be good to actually have access. I'm going to break this down and highlight a few bits. But this is coming from Leviticus chapter 4, verses 27 through 31. This is one description of the so-called sin offering, or purification offering, if you're familiar with some of the work of Jacob Milgram and others. This is not the only sacrifice, right? When you look at the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, we are introduced to 5 different major categories of sacrifice. There's the whole burnt offering, there's the grain offering, no slaughter at all, right? There's the so-called peace offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, okay? So we're just looking at one of these for the moment, and it's one instance of the sin offering. And what I want to illustrate is that this is presented in Leviticus 4 as a process. First, an offerer brings the offering. The language here is the language of gift. This is especially clear in Septuagint, which renders the underlying Hebrew with this word doron, this word for gift. So, the first thing you have to do is bring an offering. After this, as the offering is brought, by the way, you have to bring it to the tabernacle, then later the temple, right? You cannot just offer Levitical sacrifice anywhere. One of the things that separates Second Temple Jewish sacrifice from a lot of pagan or Greco-Roman sacrifice is that it has to be offered only in Jerusalem, more or less. Right, there are a couple of fuzzy edges, but really you have to offer sacrifice in Jerusalem. So you bring the gift, then the offerer lays one hand on the head of the animal, and then, at least according to the Hebrew text tradition, Masoretic text, the offerer then is the one who most likely slaughters the animal. And the animal is slaughtered in the place of the burnt offering. Now this would be in the courtyard. We'll come back to this point, okay? After the slaughter of the animal, then the priest comes in and begins to do certain things. The priest takes some of the blood. There's a lot that's assumed here. And we can fill some of this in from other parts of Leviticus. But the priest has collected the blood in a bowl. So the priest takes the blood in the bowl and puts some of the blood on the horns of the outer altar. This is your run-of-the-mill, everyday sin offering, okay? The rest of the blood is then poured at the front base, the bottom part of the outer altar, okay? And then there are parts of the body of the animal. It's not just about the blood. There's also things that happen with the body of the animal. So the animal has to be butchered. Again, this would happen by the priests. The fat is removed, and the priest then takes the fat and some other parts and places them on the altar and burns them. And as a result of going through not just a single one of these activities, but all of these activities, then the priest, again, this is implicit, but the point seems to be, the priest can determine that atonement has occurred. We'll obviously come back to that word. And what's the result then? The offerer is forgiven. The sin, which led to the offerer bringing the animal and led to the rest of the process, is dealt with in some way. Okay? So, we have here an entire process. Sacrifice does not occur when you slaughter the animal. Sacrifice does not occur when you put the blood on the altar. Sacrifice does not occur even just by burning. It's the whole process together, which is the sacrifice. And it is precisely in bringing this sacrifice into the presence of God, the process culminates there, as a gift, that there are certain benefits that can accrue or become available to the offerer. We'll come back to this point. This is not in the Jewish mindset. This is not magic. You do not manipulate God. It all depends on God accepting the gift. The prophets have a lot to say about this, as I'm sure you'll know. Leviticus 7:37 through 38 summarizes all of the sacrifices that are laid out in those first 7 chapters and talks about them in terms of offerings or gifts that are to be brought to the Lord. So there's that idea again that this is a gift which is given to God. But let's think for a moment about giving something to God, because there's an implication here that I think sometimes in our modern ways of thinking we tend to overlook. I would suggest that we tend to view sacrifice in very abstract and indeed moral terms. But there are certain realia here in the process which actually require directionality. When you give a gift to God, you actually have to bring the gift in such a way that it enters into his presence. And this actually is happening throughout the process of sacrifice. And that brings us to the altars. There's more than one altar in the Israelite tabernacle and later in the Jewish temple. There are 2 altars, potentially 3, depending on how we treat the Ark of the Covenant. But there's an outer altar of burnt offering, the bronze altar, and then there's an altar in the first room of the tabernacle, the holy place, which is a golden altar. And on that altar, incense is burnt. Then behind the curtain is the Ark of the Covenant, which receives blood on the Day of Atonement, which suggests that it can at least be treated as if it were an altar. It's more than that. It's God's throne. But it seems to act as an altar. So what are these altars? They appear to be the place where the elements of the gift are conveyed into the presence of God. And there are different ways in which this is thought about. When you burn something, the smoke ascends. It actually enters into God's heavenly presence. But God in the Jewish mentality is also present in some very special way, some way in which he's not present anywhere else in creation, in the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple. This is God's throne room. This is where he sits, on earth at least, enthroned between the wings of the outstretched cherubim. That is, he sits enthroned on the Ark of the Covenant. So bringing the gift into the presence of God not only occurs by applying blood or burning something on an altar, but also by actually going into the Holy of Holies and presenting blood in particular as well as incense in the presence of God on earth in the Holy of Holies. The gift is offered to God. It even ascends to him by way of the pleasing aroma. This is a motif that shows up multiple times in Leviticus in particular. The pleasing aroma that comes from the smoke rising from the altar. And then it is also presented by way of blood and parts of the flesh coming to God's house, and blood in particular entering into his house by going into the Holy of Holies. That's how it's given to God. Now, that brings us to a point that I've alluded to already. The Jewish altars, and this, by the way, is the general practice as well in Greco-Roman sacrifice, are not the places where slaughter occurs. Full stop. There is no slaughter on the altars at the tabernacle or the altars at the temple. It just is not the place where slaughter happens. Blood is applied to them, and elements of the offering are burned on the altars, but nothing is killed on the altar. If we look at a basic model of the tabernacle, we can see that the bronze altar stands in the courtyard outside the tent, which is divided basically into 2 rooms, the holy place and the most holy place. Most animals are slaughtered, many of the animals are slaughtered somewhere here. If an animal is most holy, it's slaughtered to the north side of the bronze altar, but it is never slaughtered on the altar. And then we can see that there's actual physical direction that occurs, because the animal is taken, parts of the animal are taken and burned here, and the blood is taken and applied here. In some cases, blood goes in and is applied to the altar of incense. No flesh is ever burnt on the altar of incense. The only thing burnt there is incense, but blood is applied to the altar in some cases of the sin offering. And then on the Day of Atonement, and only on the Day of Atonement, this is Leviticus chapter 16, the high priest takes blood and actually goes into the Holy of Holies with incense burning and sprinkles blood on the Ark of the Covenant. So you can see there's actual physical movement here. As you take a sacrifice or the parts of a sacrifice and then present them, bring them in to the presence of God. Now, within this process, there is actually a hierarchy. I'm happy to field questions. I don't know what the best way to run this is, but I see a hand. I don't want to ignore a question.
I just wondered about this slaughtering on the altar, because from the story about Abraham and Isaac,
yes,
Isaac was placed upon the firewood on the altar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well done. So Genesis 22, and there are a couple of other places, some of the Psalms, indicate that there were times in which animals were slaughtered on the altar. But I promise I'm not just trying to play a game here. But that is not Levitical practice. This is something that's different, okay? And even in the case of Genesis 22, and by the way, Genesis 22 is obviously going to inform what early Christians are thinking. So we need to bear that in mind. I'm not trying to ignore that. But even when we take Genesis 22 as it stands, we tend to read Genesis 22 and focus on the slaughter of Isaac. But I don't think that that's the most natural way to read that text from an ancient Jewish perspective. The focus is much more likely to be on the burning of the sacrifice. And in fact, it's right there in Genesis 22 itself. Isaac, he's a very bright young lad. Isaac figures out there's going to be a sacrifice. But what is it? The text tells us, actually. What is it that allows him to deduce that there's going to be a sacrifice? He says to his father, I see the wood and I see the fire. Where is the sacrifice? Now, oftentimes when I'm teaching this, I'll raise this as a question for students, and inevitably someone will say, oh, it's the knife. That's not what the text says. Isaac does not focus on the knife. He focuses on the wood and the fire. Why? Burning. That's the real center here. And there are some later rabbinic traditions that actually assume that Isaac was offered and that he was somehow raised again from his ashes. Like, the ashes are key. I think it's Josephus who talks about Isaac joyfully going to the altar. Again, not because he's looking at it as a solemn, somber occasion of death, but because he's thinking about, today I will enter the presence of God. So again, these ideas of direction, moving into God's presence, and the ideas which is correlated with the burning, these seem to be the center there. But let me just add one other thing. There are significant portrayals of the sacrifice of Isaac that we get in ancient synagogues and some early Christian art, in some of the catacombs, for example. And I haven't actually done a count of these, but roughly half of these portrayals actually have Isaac kneeling next to the altar. Why? Because that's how they assume sacrifice happens. You're absolutely right, the text says he's bound and placed upon the altar. But when they draw it, they imagine it the way they know sacrifice works, with Isaac next to the altar. So, yeah. That's a fun little detour, so thank you for bringing that up. But let me add then to these bigger ideas that sacrifice is not just a process. It is a hierarchically structured process. And while this may come as something of a shock to us, the focal point is not the slaughter. I mean, this goes back to the Genesis 22 question. Isaac doesn't focus on the knife. He focuses on the wood and the fire. Because this idea of going into the presence of God is the focal point. So altars, what happens on the altars, and conveying the gift into God's presence, these are among the most important aspects of sacrifice. Now, I think this follows logically from just looking at the text in Leviticus. But wouldn't it be nice if there was some biblical evidence? And there actually is. So here again is a large text from Ezekiel chapter 44. And we're going to break this down. Ezekiel 44 talks about the restored temple and the restored Levitical and priestly service that occurs in that temple. The Levites are actually punished by God because they led the people astray by actually encouraging in some way the people to worship idols. And God says they shall bear their punishment. Now, the Levites have led the people into idolatry. All the terms of the Mosaic covenant suggest that should be it. You're cut off. But look at what the punishment actually is. They will be ministers in my sanctuary. They will have oversight at the gates of the temple, and they will minister in the temple. What kind of a punishment is this? This is, of course, grace. God is being gracious to the Levites who have led the people astray. But there is a punishment here. They get to serve in God's temple. They get to slaughter the burnt offering and the sacrifices of the people. One of the, shall we say, quotidian or just regular day-to-day things that you have to do when you sacrifice an animal is slaughter it. And the Levites, who bear their punishment, get to participate in sacrifice by slaughtering some of the animals that are brought to the temple. But here's what they don't get to do. They shall not draw near to me. They do not get to come into the presence of God. They will not get to serve as priests. There's the punishment. They get to serve in the temple, but they do not get to come into the presence of God. The Levitical priests, on the other hand, the sons of Zadok, those who kept the charge of the sanctuary when the people went astray, they will get to minister to me. They get to enter the presence of God. And how do they do that? They will stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood. Now, where are the fat and the blood offered in Levitical sacrifice? On the altars. Here, the Levitical the priests who did not lead the people astray are the ones who can actually stand before God by offering the fat and the blood. This is a way of describing what's going on at the altar. When blood and fat are brought to, in this case it must be the outer altar, the blood is applied and the fat is burned. The Levites who led the people astray don't get to participate in that. They get to help slaughter the animal, in some cases. The priests who didn't lead the people astray are rewarded, as it were. They get to offer the gifts to God by serving at the altars. They present the blood and the fat. They even get to enter the sanctuary and approach my table to minister to me. Table, by the way, is a common metaphor for the altar, right? Because the temple is God's house. And when you have a house, you expect to have a table. And if you're God or a monarch, a ruler, you get to have servants who fill your table with good things for you to enjoy. Those are the priests. Okay, so you can see there are multiple ways in which the analogy connects. So, there's a very clear hierarchy here. Slaughter is part of sacrifice. It is part of the process. But it is not the center of it. at the center is actually coming into the presence of God with the elements of the sacrifice, the blood and the flesh, and serving God at his table. The Levites, in God's mercy, are still allowed to minister at the temple. But only the sons of Zadok will get to be the priests who will actually come into the presence of God. Both of them are participating in sacrifice. But the slaughter is clearly not the way in which you bring something into God's presence. That happens when the priests bring the blood and the flesh to the altars. Now, sacrifice is not only a process, it is not only hierarchically structured so that it's most important, its focal point even, is coming into God's presence. It is also an act of giving to God, not just an act of giving something up. This is where there's a fundamental semantic problem or shift that occurs when our language of sacrifice focuses on giving up. Theologically speaking, we make sacrifice focused anthropologically. It's on the offerer who gives something up. That, I suggest, is not an ancient way of thinking about sacrifice. The focus is properly theological for the ancient mind, as it were. The focus is on giving something to. Yes, of course, you give something up. It's a gift. You're giving a gift to God. But the point is not so much on what you give, it's more on giving to a particular God. And in the case of Israelite and later Jewish thinking, the focus is very clearly on giving the gift to the one true God, the God who is the creator of all things. Sacrifice also depends on God accepting the gift. As I noted earlier, the prophets are very clear on this point. You cannot manipulate the God of Israel into doing what you want by giving him more and more bulls and rams and whatever. This God doesn't play games like that. It is an act of, theologically speaking, it is an act of this God's grace that he reveals exactly what sacrifices can and should be brought to him and under what circumstances. This, by the way, is something that separates the Levitical sacrificial code from a lot of other ancient sacrificial ways of thinking in a larger, especially I tend to think more in the Greco-Roman context. In a Greco-Roman context, you kind of have to just throw things at the altar and see what finally sticks. Or maybe you go to the oracle at Delphi and you get a very bizarre answer, a riddle that you have to solve to understand what it is that a particular god wants to help solve a particular problem. Maybe your village is facing a plague, you go to Delphi, you get some sort of oracle, you puzzle it out and discover, oh, Apollo wants a particular kind of gift. Well, apart from that knowledge of revelation, you're just stuck having to throw things at altars until finally the plague resolves and that's what Apollo really wanted. Not so with the God of the Jews. This God says clearly, here's what I want, here's when you will bring it, and we will allow our relationship. We will be able to negotiate our relationship with each other, otherwise known as covenant, by means of doing it this way. Theologically speaking, that is distinct from many other ancient ways of approaching sacrifice, and it is, I suggest, a kind of graciousness of a God who says, here's how we will be in relationship with each other, and here's how we will repair that relationship if and when we need to have some relational repair. I mean, if we take this idea of gift giving seriously, okay? Imagine in normal human relations as a kind of analogy for this. If I forget my wife's birthday, please no. I might want to have some idea of what it is that my wife likes to try and repair that relationship. I mean, we can go a little bit further with this too. If I buy some flowers and they come back and say, honey, I'm so sorry, but here are this bouquet of Gerber daisies. I know they're your favorite flower. Please accept this gift. Oh, hold on a minute. Let me beat the living snot out of these Gerber daisies. And now aren't you even happier with them? It's a very odd logic that we tend to work with. Now, it's not simple, I realize that, okay? But again, I want to suggest that in the ancient mind, violence is not what they would be thinking of in a sacrificial context. This is a highly ritualized, highly structured and orderly series of things that occur in the process of bringing the gift that God has said, this is what you will bring. And by the way, as again the prophets repeatedly say, this is not just bring that gift and then we're good. It's also, you need to actually do this from the heart. There is very much an attitude of repentance that has to come along when the gift is given to try and repair the relationship. Okay? Now, all of this, I think, I've already anticipated this point, but sacrifice is very much an aspect of the worship of the God of Israel. It is deeply relational. In Exodus, worshiping God with sacrifice is actually the reason given. And this occurs more than one time throughout the story in the first 12 chapters of Exodus. This is the reason that is given for why the people should be let go by Pharaoh, let out of their enslavement, so that they can go into the wilderness and worship their God by giving that God the kinds of sacrifices that he desires. So this is deeply relational. And I want to suggest that relational idea, we've focused mainly on the sin offering, but this extends to the other sacrifices as well. It is about gift giving. Sacrifices are given for multiple reasons. It can be about making a vow to the Lord, and then God allows the thing, and now you pay your vow. You give to the Lord what you vowed to give. That is an act of giving thanks. Thank you, God. You saved me. Here's a gift to say thank you. I said I would give you this gift, and here it is. And it can simply be about giving thanks and showing love, full stop. You are an amazing God. Here's a gift, right? Again, I hope you can see that there are all kinds of analogies that are going to hit here with regular human relationship. This is a way of showing love. It is a way of showing respect. It is a way of showing care. It's about worship. But when it comes to what we're going to talk about as atoning sacrifice, this kind of sacrifice is able to help solve certain problems that arise within the relationship. The need to give flowers because something went wrong in the relationship. There's a great commercial in the US. A guy is sitting playing video games on the couch, and his wife walks in and says hello, and suddenly he realizes he's forgotten something. And from the context, it's like he's clearly forgotten a birthday or something. And he stops and says, "Oh, honey, I realize it's your birthday. I was going to get you flowers." And she's like, "Oh, thank you so much. I love you. Thanks for..." And the tagline is, wouldn't it be nice if it really was the thought that counted? It's a commercial for a flower delivery business. Well, oh my goodness, tomorrow's my wife's birthday. You get the flowers, okay? In a similar kind of way, right? We tend to think about sacrifice in these very abstract terms. But in this ancient practice, this is not an abstraction. It's not just the thought that counts. It's actually bringing the gift. And in the bringing of the gift, when there is a problem that arises in the relationship, these problems can be resolved. And this is where we're going to go next as we start to think about this terminology of atonement.